If I tell you we just had a session in which, amongst other things, we're talking about what happens after nuclear weapons have been used, I think you will get a sense of the atmosphere.
We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead.
Перемога за нами. Слава Україні.
War is back on our continent.
De strijd in Oekraïne is nog onbeslist. Maar in dit veilige Londense hotel proberen historici, diplomaten en veiligheidsdeskundigen al een beetje in de toekomst te kijken. Voorlopig kan Oekraïne ook militair op het Westen blijven rekenen, verwacht de beroemde oorlogshistoricus Lawrence Friedman.
The basic view about the war in Ukraine is to support Ukraine to whatever will be the bitter end. I think the main divergences of opinion are more speculative, which is to what extent is there a risk as the costs increase, as the economic fallout gets worse, whether Western public opinion can sustain its support for Ukraine, which it's a very expensive business as well as carries all sorts of other risks. But by and large, I think the consensus would be that there's not a lot of choice at the moment. You just have to keep on going.
In de zaal heerst dus eensgezindheid. Maar daarbuiten is die uiterst fragiel. Rusland tegen de rest van de wereld. Het is misschien wel het grootste misverstand van de huidige crisis.
However we see it, much of the rest of the world sees it quite differently. So we may see it as the war of recolonization in Ukraine, democracy versus autocracy, but not just China, India, Brazil, South Africa, probably the majority of the world's population, the global south, see it very differently. And I think we in the West really have to wake up to that.
If you look at the UN votes, for example, the initial vote looks very bad for Russia. There's only 4 countries that vote with them, and the vast majority vote to condemn the Russian invasion. But if you look at the countries that abstained, actually it's more than half the world's population. Now that's slightly distorted by the fact that India and China alone represent about 40% of the world population. But they are also countries that the US would have hoped would have been with them. Countries like South Africa, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, as you mentioned, which had been a close US ally for a while under Bolsonaro. So I think there's this sense that we're not winning the argument here.
In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment.
NATO is back, the West is back, we are all together, fighting for democracy against autocracy, and we feel good because we are on the good side.
Gérard Araud bekleedde talloze topposities op het Franse ministerie van Buitenlandse Zaken en besloot zijn loopbaan 3 jaar geleden als ambassadeur in Washington. Het Westen, zegt hij, moet zich niet blind staren op zijn eigen grote gelijk.
If you meet or you discuss this issue with Africans or with Indians, you are surprised to see that actually they don't see this war as good against evil. That they think that Russia has a point, even in terms of the export of grains and wheat. You would expect the Africans to say that's really because of Russia. No, they don't say that.
Why not?
Because I think, first the Russian narrative is, as you know, we are ready to let it if you drop the sanctions. And for the Africans, they say, yes, why? Why don't you really drop the sanctions? But beyond that, and I discovered that when I was the French ambassador to the United Nations, I think we underestimate the resentment of the third world against the West. A lot of people say, basically the US did the same with Iraq in 2003. An Indian friend of mine said, I don't remember the sanctions against the US in 2003.
Voor een groot deel van de wereld is het morele gezag van de Amerikanen sowieso verdwenen. En al zijn ze nu even terug in Europa, zoals vroeger wordt het nooit meer.
We have lived the Cold War with 2 powers, superpowers, really managing the world. After that, we had only one superpower, was really was the policeman of the world, but now it's over. It's over because the policeman is tired and going back home, and also because the balance of power has shifted against the US. It doesn't mean there is a decline of the US, but there is a relative decline of the US. And suddenly we are back, in a sense, we are back in a world of big and middle-rank powers. It's a jungle. We are back to the jungle.
If Russia is isolated and their economy is broken, that in a sense sends a message that the West, through its financial power, and particularly through the power of the dollar, remains, despite everything, the kind of dominant force in geopolitics and in geoeconomics. On the other hand, if you put it the other way, if we throw everything at Russia and they come out of this okay, they survive with the support of China and others, then I think actually the Western-dominated order looks less good. And the Chinese will say, okay, maybe we can start building an alternative system, start trying to promote alternatives to the dollar, which is really a key to American power.
We're clearly going into a new period. How that new period will look depends crucially on the outcome of the war. The nature of any peace depends on the course of the war before it, which is why it's so important that Putin doesn't win this war, because if he can claim a victory, that will not only set new terms for the European order, it will also set new terms for the Asian order, and watch out Taiwan.